The old caretaker stopped me and warned, "Look closely. Your son is acting strange at that grave." Welcome, dear listeners. If stories about family secrets and moral choices interest you, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you won't miss any new stories. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I always love seeing where you are in the world. Now, settle in. Let's begin. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. The dust in my apartment moves like it has its own quiet thoughts. In the morning light that slips past the heavy velvet curtains, it spins and drifts, settling on books stacked from floor to ceiling. This isn't really my library. It's my late husband's kingdom, and I've been its keeper for years. It's been exactly 5 years since he died. The place still breathes him, his tobacco, his ink, his habits. The big mahogany desk in the middle of the living room is still his. The armchair is still shaped to his shoulders. My own small writing desk near the window, once covered with geraniums and notebooks, has been abandoned so long that dust lies on it like a second tablecloth. 5 years, and every anniversary feels the same, thick and heavy, like walking through syrup. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, but the cold I felt came from somewhere deeper. I was waiting. I always was, on this date. Sure enough, the doorbell rang, sharp, cutting through the hush of the library. It was my son Jabari and his wife Niara. They always came on this day. Not for remembrance, but for opportunity. "Mama!" Jabari boomed as he stepped inside, hugging me with a kind of practiced warmth. He smelled of expensive cologne and stress. Niara followed, her face wearing the perfect expression of solemn sympathy. Her eyes, however, went straight to the shelves, measuring, counting. "Tea," I offered. "We could use something stronger," Jabari sighed, dropping into his father's armchair like he was auditioning for the role. Niara slid onto the sofa, already ready to start. The speech was familiar. Business troubles, import, export difficulties, crooked partners, a container stuck in port, hundreds of thousands at stake. They spoke of merchandise trapped in Charleston and how one more urgent payment would save everything. Their debt, their future, their lives, always hanging by the thread of my bank account. Before I would have felt guilty, torn, motherly. But after these 5 years of pleas and half-truths, all that was left in me felt dry and brittle. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. "I need to see what I have." They were clearly disappointed. They'd expected instant surrender to their crisis. Jabari paced to the window, folding his hands behind his back the way his father used to do. But the resemblance stopped there. It was an imitation, not an echo. Then he turned, eyes glistening on command. "5 years since Dad left," he murmured, voice trembling. "I still feel like he's about to walk in. I'm going to visit his grave. I need to sit with him. Alone." A single perfect tear slid down his cheek. Niara watched him with open admiration. It was a performance, of course. I knew his tricks. I'd watched him rehearse them all his life. And yet, something in me flinched toward hope. What if, for once, it was real? What if there was something soft still alive in him, a son missing his father, not just a man chasing money? "That's good, Jabari," I whispered, and this time my voice trembled with something genuine. "That's very good." He rushed out, as if afraid I'd look too closely and see behind the mask. Niara stayed another moment to polish the illusion. "He's so affected, Miss Johnson," she murmured, using my husband's surname like a prop. "He loved his father deeply. He just doesn't show it." When they left, the apartment fell back into its usual heavy silence. But inside me, a small, fragile warmth flickered. I needed, to believe. I wanted to see my son kneeling at his father's resting place, alone with his grief, proving to me that I still belonged to a real family and not just a shared last name. I changed clothes quickly and took 3 deep red carnations from the vase, the flowers I'd bought that morning for my husband's portrait. I called a cab to a nearby street so they wouldn't see me. The whole way to Pine Ridge Cemetery, I pictured it. Jabari at the crypt, head bowed, a private conversation between father and son. If I saw that, I thought, maybe I could help him one more time. The cemetery greeted me with cool air and the soft rustle of old trees. I walked along the familiar gravel path toward the black granite family mausoleum, heart thudding with something dangerously like hope. I was almost there when a tall, stooped figure stepped out from a side path. Ephraim, the groundskeeper. He'd worked there for years. My husband had helped him once, long ago, when Ephraim's family had nowhere to go. We usually just exchanged nods. But today, he walked straight up to me, his face unusually grave. "Good afternoon, Miss Johnson," he said quietly. "Hello, Ephraim," I answered. "I'm here to see my husband. My son is all ready." He placed a rough, calloused hand gently on my shoulder and met my eyes with a seriousness that drained the warmth from my chest. "Mrs. Jones," he murmured, using my maiden name, "don't go to the crypt. Not right now. You need to see what your son is actually doing first." I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. Something in his tone told me the answers would hurt. He led me along a narrow, overgrown path to a small rise with an old leaning iron fence. Through the branches of wild lilacs, our family crypt was clearly visible. "You can see everything from here," he said. "They can't see you." I gripped the cold metal and watched. It didn't take long. Jabari appeared with Niara at his side. No flowers. No hesitation. No sign of prayer or even quiet. Their walk was brisk, purposeful, like they were entering a warehouse rather than the resting place of the man whose name they'd built their lives on. Jabari took a heavy key from his pocket, unlocked the iron door to the crypt, and they slipped inside like they were walking into a storage unit. Minutes later, a third figure approached, a man in a dark coat, face hidden in the shadows. He glanced inside and spoke briefly. And then I saw my son and his wife emerge, each carrying something wrapped carefully in dark cloth, one long parcel, one square. They handed the bundles over like practiced smugglers. The wind carried bits of their quiet conversation. "Flawless work," the stranger said, lifting a corner of the cloth. "No expert will catch it at a glance." "I told you, this isn't some cheap market fake," my son replied with pride. "This is high class." "And the museum? Is everything clean with the Atlanta Museum of Art?" Niara's voice sharpened. "The director is desperate for that Psalter for his collection. Once they pay, we're in the clear." They laughed softly. Not a word about a father. Not a second spared for a flower, a memory, a prayer. The warmth I'd clung to for 40 years vanished in an instant. Not slowly, not sadly, just gone, like glass shattering in silence. In its place, something else settled in my chest. Cold, clear, unbearably heavy. They weren't just thieves. They were using my husband's grave as a convenient hiding place for forged treasures. The man who had spent his life defending authenticity and truth, whose work had been to protect real history from fakes, had his bones resting in the same stone as their lies. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The tears seemed frozen somewhere deep inside. I only watched them lock the crypt, tuck away the key, and stroll out of the cemetery, laughing, empty-handed. Not a single flower left behind. Only their dirt on his name. I don't remember exactly how I said goodbye to Ephraim that day. Maybe I nodded. Maybe I didn't. I just know that somehow my feet found the way out of the cemetery and into a cab. The city was moving as usual. Cars, people, traffic lights, but it all felt muffled, distant, like I was trapped under a glass dome. The only real thing was the image of my son treating his father's crypt like an illicit storage locker. When I stepped back into the apartment, the familiar smell of old paper and stale tobacco met me like a heavy blanket. The mahogany desk, the armchair, the crowded shelves, everything looked suddenly theatrical, like a museum exhibit of a man's life, preserved but no longer truly alive. My eyes turned toward the neglected writing desk by the window. My corner. My space. Or at least it had been once. I walked over, brushing dust from the surface with my fingers. Then, as if guided by someone else's memory, I pulled open the lowest drawer. It stuck for a moment, groaning in protest before giving way. Inside was a plain wooden box, small and unadorned. Around my neck, hidden under my blouse, the tiny bronze key I'd worn for decades lay against my skin. A habit I'd kept long after I'd stopped needing it. My hand went to it automatically. I unlocked the box and opened it. Inside, resting on green velvet, were the tools of a life I had abandoned: a jeweler's loupe, an ultraviolet lamp, fine tweezers, tiny scalpels. In the hidden compartment beneath them lay 3 slim volumes of my own making. Notes on pigments, watermarks, and binding methods. 30 years ago, I'd been more than a professor's wife. I'd been a senior archivist, an expert in spotting lies hidden in old paper and paint. I lifted the loupe and brought it to my eye. The lines and pores of my own hand sprang into sharp, unforgiving detail. Time, I thought, leaves its own signature. It always does. That night, I hardly slept. I didn't pace or sob or turn the whole story over in my mind. I simply sat in the dim light, looking at the closed box on my desk. Something had died in that cemetery. The naive, stubborn love that had kept me making excuses, covering debts, pretending my son meant well was gone. Gone so completely that I almost wondered if it had really been there at all. By morning, I finally moved. I took a rag and a bucket of water and cleaned my little desk with slow, deliberate motions. I repotted the geraniums. I wiped the glass on the small shelf that held my own old books, modest studies and monographs with my name, Eva Jones, on the spine. My husband's big desk in the middle of the room stayed untouched, dusty, shrine. But my corner by the window began to look like a workspace again. At noon, the doorbell rang. Hard. Impatient. This time there were no fake tears, no gentle knock. Jabari walked in, tense. Niara followed, already irritated. "So," he said without greeting, dropping into his father's chair. "Have you thought about it?" "Tea first," I replied calmly. They exchanged a look, weary, annoyed, but obeyed. I went to the kitchen and moved slowly, leaves into the teapot, hot water, a slice of lemon. In the living room, I could hear them whispering. "She's dragging this out," Niara hissed. "She has nowhere to run," Jabari answered. "She'll sign." I brought the tray back, set out the cups, and sat not on the sofa but on a simple kitchen chair I'd brought in. I watched them. Not as my child and daughter-in-law, but as strangers whose intentions I already knew. "We need an answer today, Ma," Jabari said as soon as I poured. "We have to move the money before the banks close." I stirred my tea. "Tell me something," I said, as if it were an idle thought. "Your business. Does it involve antiques? Rare books? Old art?" He blinked, thrown off. "What?" "Import-export is such a vague phrase," I replied. "I was just remembering my old work. I'm curious what you really trade in." There was a brief silence. Jabari recovered first, with a loud, dismissive laugh. "Mom, please," he said. "Not this again. We do serious work. Logistics. Supply chains. All that. Not your dusty little curiosities." Niara leaned forward and patted my hand with false gentleness, her eyes hard. "You should focus on your health, dear," she said softly. "Let the younger generation deal with business. All you need to worry about is signing the transfer. We'll handle everything else." They thought my question came from confusion. They thought my age and my grief made me harmless, even amusing. In that moment, their arrogance became my sharpest weapon. I set my cup down with care. "All right," I said lightly. "I understand." Relief flashed across their faces. "I'll need some time to look over my accounts," I added. "I want to see what I can move." "We can wait an hour," Jabari said quickly. "No," I answered, standing. "I'll do it alone. I'll call you when I'm ready." They didn't like that. But years of training had made them patient parasites. They left with a stream of advice about which account, which bank, and how to avoid awkward questions from clerks. As soon as the door clicked shut, I stood still in the quiet hallway. Then I turned, not toward the telephone, but back to my writing desk. They had forgotten who I was. I had started to remember. I opened an old address book, ran a finger down faded ink, and found the number I wanted, Pine Ridge Cemetery Lodge. It rang a long time before a familiar low voice answered. Groundskeeper's office. Ephraim, it's Eva Jones, I said, my tone smooth, controlled. It felt like putting on an old, well-made coat. I need access to our crypt. Tonight. After closing. Can you help me? He was silent for a moment, not in surprise, but in thought. Yes, he said at last. Come to the side gate. After dark. I'll be there. When twilight fell and the cemetery emptied, I dressed in dark clothes, wrapped my toolbox in a shawl, and called another cab to a nearby street. The side gate stood quiet in the moonlight. Ephraim waited in the shadows, a tall shape against the brick. Without a word, he unlocked the small gate, let me in, and locked it behind us. We walked among the gravestones, the night so still it felt like a held breath. I felt no fear. Strangely, among the dead, I felt more awake than I had for years. At the crypt, the black granite gleamed faintly. Ephraim took out a ring of keys, not the one Jabari used, but the cemetery's own master set. He paused before opening the door, turning toward me. Mrs. Jones, he said quietly. Your husband, he changed my life. When my family had nowhere to go, he paid for my studies and helped us get back on our feet. I owe him everything. His voice roughened. For 6 months, I've watched your son use this place like a loading dock. At first, I kept hoping it was something minor. But I listened. I wrote things down. He reached into his coat and handed me a small notebook, worn at the edges. Dates. License plates. Snatches of talk. I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew it was wrong. I took the notebook. It felt heavier than its pages justified. Thank you, I said simply. He nodded, unlocked the crypt door, and showed me a section of wall that looked no different from the rest. Press here and here, he demonstrated, touching 2 faint marks near the bottom. A panel will open. Lock yourself inside while you work. When you're finished, I'll hear the door and walk you out. Then he stepped back into the shadows, leaving me alone. I closed the heavy door behind me and turned the key. The air inside was chilled and still. My flashlight beam picked out the carved sarcophagus and the slabs on the wall. I found the barely visible points Ephraim had shown me, pressed, and heard a soft click. A panel slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in dark crimson cloth, lay several objects. I set one on the sarcophagus and unwrapped it. An icon stared back at me from an aged wooden board, the face painted with such subtlety and sorrow that for a moment, I forgot to breathe. The gold background glowed faintly through the darkened varnish, and the fine network of crackle looked perfectly aged. Every visible detail whispered, old, sacred, priceless. I opened my toolbox. The loop at my eye, I examined the paint, the craquelure, the way the board had been prepared, the joints on the back. My mind slipped back into its old rhythm. 30 silent years fell away. Everything matched the period. Almost. I switched on the ultraviolet lamp. Under its strange violet light, old varnish should glow a soft yellow-green. It did. But when I swept the beam over certain bright highlights of the robe, where white paint had been used, I saw it, a different glow. Cleaner. Colder. Titanium white. A modern pigment that did not exist when this icon was supposedly created. The piece was brilliant. A master's forgery. Only a handful of people in the world would notice that one chemical betrayal. And I knew one of them by name. In the silence of the crypt, his face came back to me from decades ago, a gifted, arrogant restorer who had been expelled from our institute for experimental reproductions. A man obsessed with making perfect illusions. He hadn't changed, I thought. He'd only found customers who didn't care that their treasures were lies. I carefully rewrapped the icon, put the tools away, and slid the panel closed. The mechanism clicked softly, erasing all traces of that secret storeroom. When I unlocked the crypt door, the cold night air washed over me. Ephraim was waiting just outside, as promised. I handed him his key and his gaze read the conclusion in my face without a word. We walked back in silence. On the cab ride home, I kept a hand on his notebook in my coat pocket. Resolve settled inside me, clean and sharp. I didn't want noise. I didn't want scandal for scandal's sake. I wanted the lie burned down at its root. And for that, I wouldn't start with my son. I would start with his buyer. Morning came, pale and clear. I made strong coffee and carried it to my shining desk. Ephraim's notebook lay open beside my own references. License plates, times, cars, brief notes about exchanges at the crypt. It was all there, patient and precise. They thought they were clever, careful, invisible. They weren't. I pulled out my old telephone directory again and found another number buried under years of dust. Paul Stevens, now the director of the Atlanta Museum of Art. Years ago, he'd been a young scholar who practically worshipped my husband's work. The receptionist answered in a bright voice. "Director's office. This is Eva Jones," I said. "Please tell Mr. Stevens that the widow of Professor Johnson, and former senior archivist of the National Institute of Expertise, needs to speak with him immediately. It concerns a major acquisition." There was a pause, then a sudden shift in tone. "One moment, ma'am." Almost instantly, his voice came on the line, older, but unmistakable. "Eva. My dear, what a surprise. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your husband was." "Paul," I cut in gently, "we can exchange courtesies another time. I'm calling about a 15th century Psalter you are planning to buy. From a private source." The silence on the other end turned heavy. "That information is confidential," he said slowly. "How did you come by?" "What matters is this," I continued, my voice level and professionalism. "The Psalter is not authentic. It is a high-grade forgery. Check the white pigment used in the illuminated initials. Under ultraviolet, you'll find the telltale glow of titanium dioxide, an anachronistic pigment not available when the manuscript was supposedly created." He didn't answer. I could practically hear his thoughts racing. Donors, grants, reputation. "And if you're wondering who could pull off something this sophisticated," I added quietly, "I suggest you recall a certain restorer who was forced out of the Institute decades ago. He's found new patrons." A beat of stunned recognition. "You can't mean." "I do," I said. "Personally, I don't care if he rots in some hidden studio. But I do care that your museum is about to pay good money for lies." He exhaled sharply. "I'll cancel everything and order a full analysis immediately. Eva, I'm in your debt." "Just do the tests," I replied. "That's enough." I hung up. For 2 days, the phone stayed quiet. No calls from my son. No visits. Somewhere in the city, he and his wife were trying to understand why their perfect buyer had suddenly vanished. Why their golden ticket had turned to ash. I used the quiet well. With Ephraim's help, I moved my husband's huge desk away from the center of the room. It no longer needed that place of honor. My own writing desk took its place in the middle, flooded with light. My books joined him on the shelves. The apartment didn't feel like a shrine anymore. It felt like an office. My office. Across a large sheet of paper, I began tracing connections. Dates, cars, meetings, names. Ephraim's notebook became a map of my son's secret life. Smuggling. Forgeries. Deals in the shadows. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was who he had chosen to be. On the 3rd day, the storm hit. They didn't bother with the bell this time. They pounded on the door like they wanted to break it down. "Mom, open up." I let them knock for a moment longer, then turned the lock. The door flew wide. They rushed in, faces drawn, eyes burning with panic and fury. "What did you do?" Jabari roared, stepping toward me. "Who did you call?" "The deal blew up. They pulled out. Our buyer's gone. You ruined everything." I didn't flinch. I simply turned and walked back to my desk, sat down, and picked up my pen, as if he were just a loud noise in another room. "Destroyed you," I said quietly, writing another number on my diagram, "or revealed you." He stopped mid-rant, thrown off by my tone. "What did you say?" he hissed. "You've lost your mind, old woman." "Imagine," I murmured, still writing, "that the museum finds my old hobbies quite valuable. That they're more interested in my ability to see through lies than in your import-export fairy tale." I finally looked up and met his gaze. The realization dawned slowly and brutally on his face. His anger drained away, leaving a stark, childlike fear. You called the museum," he whispered. I didn't answer. I only watched him. "You used your father's grave as a hiding place for counterfeit art," I said. My voice stayed low but filled the room. "You dragged his name, his work, and his memory through the muck. I didn't destroy anything. You did that yourself." He opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. He looked smaller, thinner, exhausted. Beside him, Niara had already begun to recover. Fear had flickered for a moment and been replaced with furious calculation. She grabbed his sleeve. "Enough," she snapped. "We're not standing here listening to this nonsense. She's clearly not well. We're leaving." Her eyes met mine, and I saw the promise there. This isn't over. They slammed the door on their way out. The apartment fell silent again. I knew what would come next. If they couldn't silence the truth, they would try to poison it. It didn't take long. 2 days later, my neighbor called, her voice tight with outrage. "Eva, have you seen the latest gossip hound? Sit down before you do." I walked to the corner store and bought a copy of the cheap tabloid. The ink already smudged my fingers as I turned to page 3. There I was. My face in an old photograph, printed next to a flattering picture of Jabari and Niara, hands clasped, eyes filled with carefully staged concern. The headline screamed, "Grief or Madness. Widow invents crimes to destroy her own son." An anonymous family friend described my supposed decline, how I was lost in the past, how I mixed fantasy with reality, and how my poor devoted son and his kind wife did everything they could to care for me while I spun wild tales about stolen treasures and faked art. The article suggested that I might be the one tied to criminals, that I'd imagined the entire scheme, that my accusations against my son were nothing more than the confused delusions of a lonely, unstable old woman obsessed with antiques. It was clever. Vile, but clever. They knew most people would find it easier to believe a story about a confused elderly woman than about a criminal son. They were trying to discredit me before I could speak again. I finished reading, folded the newspaper neatly, and felt nothing. No rage. No humiliation. Just a cold, distant contempt. I picked up the phone and called the museum director's office. "Eva Jones," I said. "Put me through to Paul." He came on the line at once. "Eva, I was about to call you. We saw that poisonous thing they printed." "Then we have our answer," I said. "They want a public fight. Let's give them one. I think it's time your museum announces a new collaboration." 1 hour later, I was sitting in Paul's office. Ephraim's notebook lay open on the table between us. Beside it, my diagram of dates, cars, and transactions. The director, the head of security, and I went through everything. I explained how the forgeries were made, how the objects were moved, how the cemetery became a secret warehouse. I walked them through the science of pigments and the art of aging materials. By the end, there was no doubt. They wanted a war, Paul said, closing the notebook and straightening in his chair. "We'll respond in our own arena, publicly, with facts. The next morning, the museum's main conference hall was packed. Journalists filled the rows, cameras glared, microphones bristled in front of the podium. Word of a major statement from the museum had spread quickly. I sat in the front row. Next to me, unassuming in a clean suit, sat Ephraim, clutching his notebook like a shield. Paul stepped up to the podium and began. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, our institution exists to protect cultural heritage and defend truth against forgery. Today, we wish to introduce a new force in that mission. He spoke of expertise, of experience, of integrity. Then he said my name. Our new special consultant on authenticity, Mrs. Eva Johnson. Cameras flashed. There was a ripple of confusion, then scattered applause. Someone in the second row nearly dropped a pen. They had clearly read about me in the tabloid the night before. I walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd. My hands were steady. I didn't talk about my son. I didn't plead my case. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I gave a short, clear explanation of how true and false artifacts reveal themselves. Under ultraviolet light, in the composition of pigments, in tiny, unplanned mistakes that no forger can completely avoid. I spoke as an expert, not a victim. The room fell silent. Then I stepped aside and invited Ephraim up. He laid his worn notebook on the podium and, in his quiet voice, explained how he had watched the comings and goings at the crypt, how he had recorded dates and license plates, not for money or glory, but out of loyalty to the man who had once saved his family. While cameras focused on his simple, honest words, something else was happening across town. At that exact time, 2 unmarked cars pulled up in front of my son's house. They were trying to flee. Suitcases stood by the door. But they didn't get a chance to carry them out. When the press conference ended, Paul's assistant hurried over. They've been arrested, he told me softly. Attempting to escape. The investigation began as soon as our tests confirmed everything you said. I heard the words. I understood them. But I didn't feel victory. No triumph. Just a vast, deep quiet. A long, ugly noise had finally been turned off. Paul shielded me from the crowd of reporters trying to surge forward, hungry for quotes about the crazy widow turned expert. That's all for today, he announced firmly. Thank you. He walked me out through a side door and into the fresh air. My son and his wife would face the law now. Judges and lawyers would take over where my work ended. There was nothing more for me to do about them. But there was still a great deal I could do, for myself. The first thing I did when I got home was open every window. The heavy curtains that had blocked the light for years came down. Sun spilled in, huge and bright, washing over shelves, carpets, and furniture. For so long, I'd tolerated the dimness because it felt respectful, like living in a permanent wake. But the man I had loved hadn't worshipped darkness. He had worshipped knowledge, clarity, and truth. The dust that swirled in the sunlight no longer looked like a symbol of grief. It was just dust. It could be swept and wiped away. So I did. My husband's desk remained along the wall, no longer a throne but an antique piece that deserved care. I put fresh flowers on it. Not wilting memorial wreaths, but bright, living blooms. My writing desk in the center of the room became the heart of the place. Reports and photographs of suspicious art from galleries and collectors arrived from all over the country. The phone rang more often now. Ms. Jones, we've got a cigarette case with papers that look perfect, someone from an auction house said one afternoon. The hallmark matches. The story checks out. Too perfect is its own warning, I replied, examining the high-resolution photograph with my loupe. See here. The stamp is placed with mathematical precision. The original craftsman's assistant had a slight tilt in his hand. His marks always lean a hint to the right. Yours is straight as a ruler. It's a modern imitation, based on an authentic model. A stunned silence on the other end. Then a promise to recheck everything. Twice a week, I stood, not behind a husband, not in the shadow of anyone, but at the front of a bright lecture room at the museum, speaking to young curators and students. They listened closely as I held up objects real and fake, showing them the difference. Do not trust first impressions, I told them. Beauty can lie. Stories can lie. Even documents can be forged. But the object itself, the fibers, the metals, the paint, doesn't lie. You only need to learn how to listen. I saw curiosity light up in their faces. And in those moments, I felt something stronger than revenge or vindication. I felt purpose. One warm afternoon, instead of going straight home after a lecture, I stopped by a florist and bought a bouquet of white lilies. Then I asked the driver to take me to Pine Ridge Cemetery. The place didn't feel gloomy anymore. The trees cast soft shade. Birds moved in the branches. The air smelled of leaves and distant cut grass. I walked the familiar path to our crypt. The heavy granite door stood still and silent. I knew what was behind it now. No hidden compartments, no wrapped parcels, no dirty secrets. Only my husband's rest. I laid the lilies on the stone, the white petals bright against the dark granite, and ran my hand over his name. Everything's as it should be now, I whispered. Your name is clean again. And so is mine. I stayed there for a while, not as a woman chained to the past, but as someone who had finally stepped fully into her own life. On my way back, I saw Ephraim in the distance, sweeping the path. He paused when he noticed me and gave me a single respectful nod. I returned it. We were both keepers, of places, of memories, of truth. As I left the cemetery and walked toward the sunlight, I no longer felt like an extension of someone else's greatness or a mother defined by her son's choices. I was simply myself. Eva Jones. My story didn't end with betrayal. It began with remembering who I had been all along. Dear listeners, that's where we leave Eva for now. Not as a victim, but as a woman who reclaimed her name, her work, and her future. She made an incredibly painful choice, turning her own son in by exposing his crimes. Some will say it was cold. Others will say it was the only honest path left. What do you think? Was she right to let justice take its course, even when it meant watching her son face the consequences? Could she have done anything differently? And would you like to hear a follow-up about what happens to Eva and whether Jabari ever tries to reach out to her again? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss new life stories. Your support, your likes, shares, and even a super thanks if you feel generous, helps me keep bringing you more tales like this. And before you go, let me know in the comments. Did you enjoy this story, and from which city are you listening? On your screen you'll see 2 more life stories I think you'll love. Click on one, stay with us a little longer, and I'll see you in the next story, with respect and care.